We meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
So we are here today with Carolina Barretto, who is the head of projects, banking, and natural resource practice and a board member at Veirano Advogados, which is a Brazil project finance firm. So thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brad. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you today.
Yes, I mean, we're told that you are one of the top project finance experts, not just in Brazil, but all of Latin America. So it's our honor to have you on the call. And I'd love to just start by learning a little bit about you and where you grew up and what it was like.
Sure. I'm originally from Rio. Veirano, our firm, is a national firm. It has offices throughout Brazil, but the original firm started out in Rio. And Rio always had this really important natural resources center, because a lot of the main, the Petrobras, which is the main national oil company, is based in Rio. So is Eletrobras, which is now smaller in size, but used to be, the largest state-owned utility in Brazil. So there's always been this hub of activity there in the natural resources sector. So I started working at Veirano as a trainee. I was 19 years old. And the very first project that I got involved in was the construction of the Brazil-Bolivia pipeline project, which is a fascinating project that spans not just through Brazil, but other countries in Latin America as well. Just in Brazil, the pipeline goes through 5,000 different municipalities. So it's a huge, huge project. It was very complex. And it was the very first assignment that I was involved in.
Oh my God.
So I obviously fell in love with it and thought it was a fascinating sector. And so that's how I started out. And then when I was still a junior lawyer in 2001, Brazil had this major energy crisis. There were blackouts. There was a huge, there were a series of factors. There was a huge drought. And in those days, Brazil relied just mostly on large hydro projects. It didn't really have any diversified, energy matrix that could make up for the droughts. And there was some deregulation at the time that some people questioned was not, that well designed. And so there was this huge, huge crisis. And then the government launched this program, which was called the Emergency Power Program, which basically invited companies that were able to build power plants on a very short time scale. So these were mostly thermal power plants.
Yes.
And anybody who was able to build really quick got, really favorable contracts, long-term power purchase agreements at very favorable rates. So there was this rush at the time for companies that could meet this demand. And we had this client that was a Finnish power plant producer that they produce engines and services, not only for the power sector, but also for the ship industry. It's a company called Wärtsilä. And they were at the time interested in developing projects. So I started working with them, and it's been a very fruitful partnership. They've been my clients for over 20 years now. So we ended up helping them build lots of power plants at the time. And it was fascinating.
And what is lots? What is lots? Is it 5, 10, 50, 100? What is a lot?
At At the time, we had 2 in northeastern Brazil. Then we had another 3 in Amazonas, in Manaus. So that they had, a good run at that time.
And when you say a thermal power plant, I assume it's fossil fuels, but which one? Was this oil burning, gas? What did they burn?
At the time, this was heavy oil mostly. It was what people could get their hands on really fast.
And where did it come from? Does Brazil produce oil itself, or does it get it from Venezuela, or how does it get a hold of oil?
It had a bit of both. Petrobras is an oil producer, but I believe they did also buy from Venezuela quite a lot at the time. But the energy matrix in Brazil has developed since then, because this was like an emergency program, right?
Yeah.
And then a few years after that, in 2004, the Brazilian government decided that, it's nice to be super green and rely on hydro, but if you have drought, it's a problem, right?
Yeah.
So they started out, they launched this program, which was the Alternative Renewable Incentive Program, which was the very first program through which we started having wind projects in Brazil. And they also had incentives for biomass, for solar, and for small hydro projects. And this was how the wind industry started out in Brazil. Wow. And since then, it's amazing because they started out needing lots of incentives, right? So prices were really high. It was really on the basis that we really needed to invest, diversify the matrix so that we weren't so heavily dependent on the large hydro dams. And since then, this market has grown so much that nowadays wind is really competitive price-wise,
And 2 questions on that front. What was happening in 2004 that Brazil decided they wanted to become green? I mean, even in the US, like we weren't really concerned about green stuff back then.
It wasn't, I think it wasn't necessarily wanting to become green, because Brazil was already green. At the time, I think the energy matrix in Brazil was like 93% renewable, but it was all large hydro renewable.
I see. So it was more just about diversity of energy generation.
Exactly. And ensuring, safety in the grid so that it wasn't just relying on one specific source of energy. Mm-hmm. So I think that was the main driver. We've had, obviously, since then, lots more gas projects than we used to. And that's also, when we look at where the market is going, I see that growing a lot comparatively to other countries. Even
now you see gas growing in Brazil.
Yeah, absolutely. We've actually just passed a new gas law in Brazil. Gas in Brazil was still very basically a monopoly of Gaspetro, which is the gas subsidiary of Petrobras. So there's this new gas law that incentivizes deverticalization, new players coming into the market. And now we have this pre-salt oil, which is very, very deep sea oil. Mm-hmm. It's a huge reserve. And it not only there's oil there, but there's also gas, right?
Right.
So we worked on this really interesting project, which is the very first power plant in Brazil that will run on gas coming from this pre-salt. Wow. For many years, this reserve was there. It was huge, but it was also very expensive to explore because it's very, very deep. So for a long time, the technology wasn't there or wasn't economically viable. And now the pre-salt layer is being explored. And we now also have gas from pre-salt. So that's also something that is changing the market. So
it seems like everywhere you go around the world, we're able to extract more gas than ever. The gas plants are extremely easy to stand up. These are even though they're big facilities, they put them up in less than 2 years. I mean, the construction sometimes just takes 12 months for a 600 megawatt gas plant. It's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it is really important to, continue to diversify the Brazilian energy matrix. Since then, wind has grown hugely in Brazil. We started having utility scale solar which is still, it hasn't been very many years that we've had utility scale solar in Brazil. That's also growing tremendously. But I think it's really important to continue diversifying and looking at, what else is there? What else can we do, right?
Yeah, tell me a little bit about how the Brazilian industry might contribute to the power sector. Do they produce some of the parts to these plants in the country itself, or is a lot of it imported?
No, a lot of it is imported, but a lot of it is also locally produced, and that I think may have a little bit to do with how these projects are financed. Up until very recently, the main lender for these types of projects was the Brazilian Development Bank. It's called BNDES. And BNDES has this rule that they finance as long as a certain content is locally produced.
Yeah.
Because the objective is obviously to develop the country, right? So, for example.
And on that front, sorry to cut you off, but I'm always curious, the development banks, did they have a dual mandate that allows them essentially to take a little bit higher risk level on the project itself too than a traditional bank would? Like, for instance, if someone was bringing a new technology, like it's a new wind turbine, it's bigger, it has slightly different blades or something, would the Brazilian Development Bank be a good source of capital for that project? Or would they treat it like any other bank and say, listen, we don't want to debt finance anything that's too fancy?
They should have this mandate, right, of incentivizing new developments, new technology. But I think they're quite traditional still. The tendency would be, this is taxpayers' money here that we're lending. We want to make sure that it's actually, something that has been tried and tested, right? So they will normally actually only finance equipment that they have approved, So there's this concern, obviously, about not being overly adventurous with taxpayers' money that is being lent.
And will they, can you take a project and chop it up into pieces? Let's say that the power generation, so let's say it's like a new type of solar thermal or something, and the solar thermal part is new, but the steam turbine is still a standard steam turbine. Can you go to the Brazilian Development Bank to finance just the steam turbine part because there's some sort of recourse, or would they not want to touch it because the whole project is new?
No, I think they would be open to that. And it's actually something that is somewhat of a change, a development in the Brazilian Development Bank's role. Yeah. They are a lot more open to co-financing opportunities and to having this role of perhaps helping attract other lenders to finance this market in Brazil. So I think nowadays, they are a lot more open to the sorts of structures that they would be willing to participate in, as opposed to, in the past where it was really, there's just one format and either you fit in or you don't, right?
Yeah. And what about other Latin American development banks? Are there other regional banks that also play a similar role?
Yes, absolutely. There's a number of different regional banks that play a role. Particularly, I see CAF, Corporación Andina de Desarrollo. They're very involved in financing a number of energy projects and occasionally working in cooperation, for example, with BNDES, where it's, projects that have this international dimension. And another big change that we're seeing looking at the market is that it used to be that it was mostly development banks financing these projects, right? But with the dramatic decrease in interest rates, it's become a lot more attractive to finance these projects in the capital markets. So we see a lot more, even individual investors. In Brazil, there's some tax incentives for individual investors that want to purchase debentures, for example, that are, for energy and infrastructure projects. So we see this as a really interesting development as well, trying to diversify the sources of funding for this project.
And what type of interest rates are we talking about? What would be the debt component for any one of these power projects?
Well, it varies a lot depending on the project, obviously. But to give you an idea, until maybe perhaps we're talking 2 or 3 years ago, the basic interest rate in Brazil was something like 12 to 13% a year.
Wow.
And now it's dropped to two and something.
To what?
So to 2.25 a year.
2 to 3%.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. I mean, and that's interesting because I mean that falls in line with what I've seen from other, like export banks, from the U.S. Around the 5% mark or less, or in other of these development bank type programs where it's like just slightly above LIBOR. What is the reason? What has created this shift where they can maintain such low interest rates?
I think it's mostly been a shift in the Brazilian economy. Brazil faced hyperinflation for many, many, many years. It got controlled starting as of 1994. We had this new currency. At the time, inflation was reached up to like 2,000% a year. It was crazy. I remember the days when you would go buy something, in the grocery store in the morning, and then you went back in the afternoon and you wanted to buy the same thing. It was no longer the same price. It was just crazy. So we have obviously this fear of hyperinflation. It's been under control for several years now.
Yeah.
But I think it took a very long time for the market to really believe that this was under control.
I see. So it was the fear of hyperinflation that kept interest rates high, but now people are no longer as afraid, which means you can lower them again and tempt inflation.
Exactly, and tempt inflation. Inflation has been rising. Yeah. It's a tricky decision for policymakers, right?
Yeah.
So it is expected that interest rates actually may start being raised again in Brazil because inflation is around the corner and you have to be careful.
Can you come back to what you were just saying about living through a period of hyperinflation? I've actually never really gotten to talk to anyone about this. So help me understand, what happens to everyone who has money, who's like upper middle class? Do they just lose everything that they have?
No, it was crazy at the time. If you had money, you could invest it. It was called the overnight market. And because of inflation and the whole economy was indexed to inflation, right? Because it was so high. People who had money made a lot more money, but
they made more money.
Yeah, they made more money because a lot of investments were indexed to inflation. So if you had money, you made more money, but you could never really tell what was the actual buying power of the money that you had, right? It was very hard to get a sense of what that money was actually worth. So it was very tricky. Whereas on the other hand, if you had no money, if you had debt, it was horrible because, you were on the other side of that, right? And needing ever more money to pay for things because the prices kept increasing. So it took a very long time for the Brazilian economy to be sort of uncoupled from these protections that were in place that indexed absolutely everything to inflation.
Wow. Okay. I didn't know about that structure, the indexing to inflation. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And how long does that go on for? Like when there's a period of hyperinflation before people just throw their hands up and say, this is ridiculous. I can't afford food, do something government. Are we talking weeks, months, years? How long does hyperinflation last?
Brazil went through a hyperinflation period for many, many years. They did try lots of things. We had several changes in currency. Just in my lifetime, I'm not that old, right? We had cruzeiros, then cruzeiros novos, then CRVs, then there were maybe just 3 or 4 different currencies until in 1994. This was the first government where we had Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was the president. He was the finance minister at the time that was responsible for what was called the Real Plan, Plano Real. And they had this, again, a change in currency. This was when the Brazilian real which is the currency that we have today, was created. And through a series of policy measures, they did manage to finally get inflation under control. But it's a long process. So throughout these years, Brazil has been known to be the country with the highest real interest rates in the world. That has only very recently changed, right?
Yeah. And
so what this means for investors is that investors in Brazil were used to just leaving their money in the bank, and just even the safest investments possible had really interesting returns, right? And now that's no longer the case. So you see a lot more corporate investors, institutional investors, individual investors looking at how to improve returns on investment. And that means necessarily taking more risks, right?
And what's the general position towards foreign investment? Does Brazil encourage it, and how would it do so?
Brazil definitely encourages foreign investment. It's a lot more open than it used to be in the past. There were quite a lot of foreign exchange controls in place that obviously made international investors a little worried. But it's changed a lot since then. The regulations have been modernized. There's a new regulation actually being discussed in Congress now to even further modernize and liberalize the Brazilian foreign exchange market. So it is, Brazil desperately needs foreign investment, and everybody is very aware of that. I think the one thing that we haven't been able to solve yet is that there's a restriction in Brazil to having contracts between two Brazilian entities linked to foreign currency. And again, this is due to the concern relating to inflation and there's this looming worry that if you start indexing the Brazilian economy to foreign currency, that could be a problem in the future. There's been other economies that have done that, and it hasn't really worked out so well. So
did that restrict, let's say, a U.S. developer that wanted to build a big solar farm? Could, if they were afraid of currency risk, would they be able to tie their offtake contract to U.S. currency instead of to the real?
That's my point. If it's two Brazilian entities, say it's the Brazilian subsidiary of the U.S. company, and the off-taker is, again, a Brazilian subsidiary of a foreign company. If there are two Brazilian entities, in theory, you can't tie that to US dollars.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So obviously, there's some exceptions to that. If there's a foreign element, there are workarounds, but it's not 100%.
And are there other ways to do it where, like, you could just, sign a services agreement with a US company for, advising services that just happens to be the same price as whatever you're going to pay for electricity or something?
Yeah, that there are mechanisms that people do resort to. So, for example, introducing a foreign party to the agreement, that could be, I don't know, a guarantor, introducing some sort of international element. But at the end of the day, it's usually a little bit artificial, right? Unless you're talking about an export project, it's not ideal. So one of the things that is hopefully set to change is precisely removing that restriction, at least for the infrastructure, which would be great, right?
Yeah.
Because it would allow quite a lot more projects to have international financing, and then obviously it's up to the entrepreneur to do the calculations and to see what hedging mechanisms need to be in place. But for these types of projects to create some sort of foreign currency element so that they can actually resort to international financial markets as well.
And what are the politics of making a change like that? And what are the politics in Brazil like in general? Do you need to change the constitution? Do you just need to pass a bill? What do you have to do to make a change just like that? You
need to pass a bill. And actually, this bill that I'm talking about, there's two houses of Congress in Brazil, right? There's the Chamber of Deputies and then the Senate. This particular one that I'm talking about actually passed the House of Deputies, so it's gone on to the Senate. So it's halfway there. Obviously, there's so many things that may seem more relevant or urgent. So priorities in Congress is obviously something that is not that easy to control.
Yeah.
But I think at least the finance ministry in Brazil was very much aware of the need to basically interfere less with private parties' decisions.
Yeah.
To the extent that it doesn't really harm, public policy, right?
And how do they come to that conclusion? Does it take like academics publishing papers? Does it take industry banging on doors? What generally changes the sentiment of a minister's position on a topic like this?
I think it's mostly industries banging on doors,
Yeah.
and that's I think a change to past governments. Over a number of years in Brazil, we had left-wing governments in power right at the federal level, and there were some ideological issues with respect to foreign investors, with respect to privatizations. So a lot of the decision-making process wasn't necessarily driven by what the country needs right now, what stage it is in right now, but rather by ideological views on that. And I think what has happened in this current government, which has a lot of issues that I won't go into because otherwise, so you know what I'm talking about. It's just crazy. But at least on the investment and finance front, there's a lot of people there that came from private companies, that worked at banks. The
know what they're doing from a private sector development perspective.
At least they hear what people have to say, right? So either they've been through it and they've seen things that could be improved, or else they're more open to receiving, industry representatives, associations that go there and say, this is actually harming my ability to do business. There's this whole trend of trying to make Brazil an easier place to do business in. So a lot of initiatives that have already been implemented to reduce red tape. There's been this big change now, for example, in the Brazilian insolvency laws. That's really new. It just came into effect.
This is like bankruptcy. Is that your term for bankruptcy?
Yeah, the new Brazilian bankruptcy law implemented this really important change that I think can have a lot of effect in the market, which is introducing this notion that the Brazilian bankruptcy law did not have, that it's important to be able to allow entrepreneurs to have a fresh start.
Yeah.
So like in the US, for example, people go bankrupt and then they go on and they do another business, and that one may work out.
It's
right?
It's the greatest part of our economy. Yeah.
Exactly. So what we had in Brazil was not that. People went bankrupt, and then it took them 20, 30 years until they were able to release themselves from those liabilities. So basically, if you went bankrupt, you would in most cases, never ever go into business again, right? And that's not very helpful for the economy.
No.
So that, for example, that has changed. We have this new law now that has just come into effect with a number of new measures seeking to allow companies to make a fresh start and to really, if they go through a bankruptcy, which is unfortunate, that they can, pay off what they owe and then that's it, and not be exposed to liabilities over a number of years, right?
And what about rules around like foreign ownership of infrastructure assets? Are there constraints there, and might that be changing anytime?
Yes, we do have this. We had this very old law. It was a law of 1972 that said that foreign entities could not own more than X amount of rural land. And this old law, very old law, had not been repealed. It was there, but it was considered as not applying anymore because the Brazilian Constitution, which was passed in 1988, says that it's not allowed to discriminate between Brazilians and international investors. So it was assumed that this didn't really apply. And then when we had the Dilma government, I think it was 2014, the government took this view. They were very concerned about Chinese investors buying up farmland in Brazil.
Yeah, that's happening around the world now. I was just
Around the
talking to
world,
somebody in the Ukraine that said that the Chinese are coming in, buying the land, depleting the topsoil, and then they're just going to leave.
Yeah, exactly. So concerned with that, what the government did was, hey, there's this really old law here. We'll say that it really does apply. The Constitution hasn't repealed it. And so they had this understanding, a legal opinion that basically revived this really old law. And it was targeted at the agribusiness sector, right? And helping to protect the local agribusiness sector from the sort of influence that could be seen as providing a threat to, the safety of food supply in Brazil or something like that. But it also had this very adverse effect that most energy projects in Brazil, they're actually built on rural land.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so what do you do with all those international investors buying land, not because they're going to plant any crops, but because they're going to build this wind project or a solar project or whatever, right? Yeah. So we had this big conundrum about what to do about that. and there's a lot of discussion also. A new law has been passed trying to differentiate between what is investment within the agribusiness sector and what is an investment within a rural land, but for an industrial activity.
Right. Another one we've been following is the nuclear sector. We heard there might be a bill that allowed for foreign ownership of nuclear assets to come in, because we see all these next generation technologies coming to fruition, and you guys already have a successful local nuclear industry, so this could be a chance to grow that as well.
Right. There was a lot of talk at one point about this liberalization. The government had a plan a few years ago of maybe building 6 or 7 new nuclear power plants in Brazil, also in this bid to diversify the matrix. But then Fukushima happened, and I think interest was severely dampened. There is this project in Brazil. We currently have 2 power plants in Angra, right? They were both owned by Eletronuclear. And there was this third power plant called Angra 3, which is a project that started construction maybe in the 80s and it stopped since then.
Yep.
And there
Siemens
is
power plant. I think Siemens was going to build that one, maybe.
Yeah. So there's a lot of discussions about finalizing that power plant. The government does have this intention to resume construction, but it's obviously a very complex project because it's halfway built, but it stopped so many years ago. So there's, finishing construction is hugely expensive. Abandoning what's there and building a whole new one is also hugely expensive. So there's been a lot of talk about how to structure that, but the plan is to move forward with Angra 3. I am not so sure about these other projects that were vented as sort of possible other alternatives, and this alternative of not, because right now this is a government monopoly, the nuclear industry in Brazil. So trying to break that monopoly or not, I wouldn't know. At the time, there was a lot of excitement about this. But since Fukushima, I think a lot of people had second thoughts about whether or not that was a good idea.
Yep. And I guess fast forwarding to today, what types of projects do you focus on mostly now?
I do lots of different projects. So I worked on this really interesting power plant that uses gas from the pre-salt layer that I was talking about. Mm-hmm. It's a project that is owned by a local fund called Patria, Shell, and Mitsubishi. So it was very, very interesting project. We've been working a lot on some other gas projects to sort of expand gas networks and reach more energy producers. I'm also working on this really interesting second generation biodiesel project in Paraguay, which is fascinating because it's very green and it can be used, this biodiesel that is generated can be used, for example, to fuel trucks without having to adapt the engines. Because the problem with biodiesel is that sometimes you can't use a regular engine, right? You need some sort of adaptation. So this type of second generation biodiesel can be used directly with no adaptation.
So this plant produces biodiesel. It doesn't use biodiesel to produce electricity.
No, it's going to produce biodiesel they use leftovers from
sugarcane husk or something.
Sugarcane husk as well, soy husk, but also I forgot the name, but it's basically the waste from cattle production.
Yes. Yeah.
Which there is a lot of in Paraguay, right? Because Paraguay is a huge cattle producer.
Right. Brazil is too, probably, no? Or Brazil, Argentina. I feel like all of Latin America has a good cow business.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's fascinating because you get to use waste to generate this very clean fuel that can also be used. It can also be used to produce jet fuel, which is one of the most highly polluting activities in the world right now, right?
And so also prevents it from releasing methane. Because I think part of the problem with this is that if it decomposes to methane, it actually has a worse greenhouse gas effect.
Exactly. So it's a fascinating project. I think there's a lot of focus right now on green projects, and green bonds to finance those projects have been heavily oversubscribed in the world. So I think there's this world demand for that, in connection with ESG and whatnot. But in the local economies in Latin America, I think we're also seeing that more clearly. It used to be perceived as sort of, this is kind of a rich people concern, let the Europeans worry about it, something like that. And nowadays, there's this real perception that it's very real and that there is a lot of opportunities for growth of the region by embracing, ESG and embracing green projects.
Yeah, because these green projects can be complex, which means that you need a lot of sophisticated inputs, whether it be, everything from like the equipment itself all the way to the type of stuff that you do, the expertise that you provide to make a project happen. So it's, while ESG might have been this, nice thing to have, now it's such a dominant part of the economy that people see opportunity and say, well, let's get involved. And that becomes self-perpetuating, which is a great thing.
Exactly. And I think a lot more people in the region are seeing the real economic benefits that can be derived from green projects, as not just doing something nice for the planet, but actually doing something that is nice for the planet, and it is profitable and it is interesting. So we're seeing a lot of activity on that front.
And as we wrap up today, maybe you can just kind of offer us some trends that you see moving forward into the future over the next 5 or 10 years. What is it that you see coming down the road that you have some unique insight into?
I think one thing that could be really interesting as a future trend would be green hydrogen. And the Brazilian government is actually already looking at that. There's an Energy Policy Council in Brazil, and they've just had this meeting on April 20, so 2 weeks ago, and they announced that they would be launching a policy for hydrogen in Brazil.
Wow.
So they're already looking at that and already looking at what needs to be done to promote this industry in Brazil, and already thinking about regulation, which I think is very innovative because it's so new all around the world, right?
Yeah, no, it's like green hydrogen is like the artificial intelligence of the energy industry. Like artificial intelligence became like so popular and everyone started thinking, oh, what can I do? And I feel like green hydrogen is like that for clean energy now.
True, with tremendous potential, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I thought it was very interesting that the government is already looking at that and already looking at developing a policy.
And just on that token, are there other industrial players that, other than Petrobras, which is the state-owned big oil, are there other chemical and oil style companies that are private that are in Brazil that would be able to help develop expertise and equipment around this space?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a number of huge international players like Shell, like Equinor, that they're huge in Brazil and definitely investing. I don't think we should rely on government to lead this, right? It is definitely the private sector that has to lead this. What I thought was interesting is that governments tend to be reactive instead of proactive. And I thought it was very interesting to see, the Brazilian government already moving to develop a framework for this sector in Brazil.
Yeah, this is very proactive because it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but possibly the thinking is if we create the right market structure to encourage the development of this technology here, we're going to develop homegrown expertise. And then we're going to be able to export our intellectual property and that homegrown expertise around the world to bring dollars back here over time. Is that the basic idea?
I think probably they're not really even focusing on technology, although this is true. For example, Petrobras has developed lots of technology. For example, this technology to explore ultra deep oil is, a lot of it was developed within Petrobras because they have the challenge, right? So, but I don't think they're probably focusing on necessarily on technology development. I think what they're probably thinking is that if they create the right market, that this could help attract green hydrogen projects to be developed in Brazil.
I see. So just the local development, the actual construction and building.
Exactly. The actual infrastructure that will be required, right?
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Final word, up to you. What do you want to leave our audience with?
It's pleasure speaking to you. And I think despite all the difficult times that we've been facing, I'm very optimistic about the future and about the region as well.
Awesome. Ana Carolina Barretto, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Fred.
Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men and for the progress of all people.